The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmland as an old pickup truck bumped down the dirt road. Behind the wheel sat Tom Wilson, a weathered man in his 60s with calloused hands and deep lines etched into his face from years of working under the open sky. The truck rattled to a stop at the edge of his property, and Tom stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he surveyed the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. 50 acres of mostly untouched countryside, with rolling hills, a small pond, and fields that had yielded crops through good seasons and bad. Tom's grandfather had purchased this land with his life savings back in 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, when most were selling rather than buying. The Wilson family had held onto it through war, drought, and economic downturns. "Not much to look at," Tom often told visitors, "but it's got good bones." His humble farmhouse stood near the entrance, painted white though the color had faded to a soft cream over the decades. A red barn, constantly in need of repair, housed his tractor and tools. The land wasn't particularly valuable by modern standards, or at least that's what Tom had always believed. He walked slowly across the field, picking up a handful of soil and letting it sift through his fingers. The developer's letter was still in his pocket, crumpled from being read and reread dozens of times. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, the first of many. Each one offering more money than the last for his strategically located property. Strategically located, Tom muttered to himself with a dry laugh. Never heard it called that before. The nearby town of Pine Ridge had been growing steadily over the past decade. What was once a quiet rural community had evolved into a bustling suburb as city folks sought more affordable housing away from the metropolitan area. New developments had sprung up, bringing with them chain stores, traffic, and something Tom hadn't expected, a homeowners association with ambitious ideas. The Lakeside Estates HOA was particularly aggressive. Their upscale community bordered Tom's farm on the east side, and they'd made it clear from the beginning that they considered his working farm an eyesore that decreased their property values. They'd filed complaints about everything from the occasional rooster crow to the smell of fertilizer in spring. Tom ignored them, as was his right. His farm had been there long before their cookie-cutter houses. But now things had changed. The HOA had partnered with a hotel chain interested in building a luxury countryside retreat that would offer wealthy tourists an authentic rural experience while providing all the amenities of a 5-star resort. And they wanted Tom's land to do it. He reached the fence line that separated his property from Lakeside Estates. On the other side stood immaculate lawns and large houses with pristine exteriors, all conforming to the HOA's strict standards. Tom's gaze drifted to a particular house at the edge of the development, a sprawling 2-story with large windows and a 3-car garage. It belonged to Robert Green, the HOA president and the man leading the charge to acquire Tom's farm. As if on cue, a black luxury SUV pulled into Green's driveway. The man himself stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit despite it being Saturday. He spotted Tom across the fence and hesitated before raising a hand in an awkward greeting. Tom nodded in response but didn't wave back. Their last conversation hadn't gone well. Green had come to his door with what he called a final offer, $2 million for the entire property. It was far more than the land was worth by any reasonable market assessment. But to Tom, the value couldn't be measured in dollars. "You're being selfish," Green had told him. "Think about the jobs this hotel will create. The tax revenue for the county. Your land is just sitting there, barely productive. We could transform it into something beneficial for everyone." Tom had simply replied, "Not everything of value shows up on a balance sheet," and closed the door. The next day, strange things began to happen. The county suddenly found building code violations with his barn that had stood for over 50 years. The environmental agency received anonymous tips about improper waste disposal on his farm. His property taxes were reassessed at a significantly higher value. It was clear that Green and his associates weren't above playing dirty. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Tom Wilson might have looked like a simple farmer, but he'd spent 4 years in the army in his youth and another 20 working as a civil engineer before returning to take over the family farm when his father's health failed. He understood how the system worked, and more importantly, he knew how to work within it. Back at his house, Tom entered his modest kitchen and sat at the oak table that had been his mother's pride and joy. Spread across it were maps, property records, and documents he'd spent weeks gathering. Next to them sat his laptop, a contrast to the vintage surroundings. The screen displayed records from the county assessor's office that few people knew were publicly accessible. Tom poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since dawn and pulled out a leather-bound journal from the drawer. It contained notes in his grandfather's handwriting, detailing the purchase of the land and subsequent years of farming. Between the pages was something the HOA and developers never suspected existed, something that would change everything about their plans. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Tom continued his research. His phone rang, green again, no doubt with another increased offer or veiled threat. Tom let it go to voicemail. He wasn't ready to speak with them yet. First, he needed to finalize his plan. In the barn, covered by a tarp, sat several metal storage boxes Tom had retrieved from a safety deposit box in town. They contained documents dating back to the 1930s, old surveys, deeds, and something particularly interesting, a geological assessment commissioned by his grandfather but never acted upon. Tom smiled as he reviewed the contents once more. Green and his HOA cronies thought they were dealing with a simple old farmer they could bully or buy off. They had no idea what was really at stake, or what Tom had quietly been setting in motion since their first offer arrived. "They want my land so badly," Tom whispered to himself as he closed the journal. "Let's see how much they really want to pay for it." In the distance, the sound of construction equipment from the latest Lakeside Estates expansion echoed across the fields. They were getting closer to his property line every day. Tom knew his time was running short, but that was fine. His trap was almost ready to spring. The following Monday, Tom drove his truck into town, parking in front of the county clerk's office. He'd made an appointment to speak with Mrs. Helen Parker, who had worked there for over 30 years and knew more about local property laws than most attorneys in the state. "Tom Wilson," she greeted him warmly as he entered her cramped office filled with filing cabinets. "Haven't seen you in here since that business with the water rights back in 14. Tom smiled and placed a jar of his homemade honey on her desk, a small token of appreciation. "Been trying to stay out of trouble, Helen. Not working so well these days." Helen's expression turned serious as she accepted the honey. "I've heard rumors about what those Lakeside people are trying to do. Shameful, if you ask me." For the next hour, Tom and Helen pored over old records, confirming what Tom had already suspected based on his grandfather's notes. When they finished, Tom felt more confident about the path ahead. "Thanks for your help, Helen. I'd appreciate if you kept this between us for now." Helen nodded. "You know I don't gossip about official business." "But Tom," she added with concern in her eyes, "be careful. These developers have friends in high places." On his way home, Tom stopped at the town's only hardware store, where he picked up several "no trespassing" signs and a new padlock for his gate. The owner, Bill Thompson, raised an eyebrow at the purchase. "Having trouble with those Lakeside folks?" Bill asked as he rang up the items. "Nothing I can't handle," Tom replied, but his tone lacked conviction. That evening, as Tom hammered the signs along his property line, he noticed a black SUV slowly driving past his farm for the third time. He wasn't surprised when it finally turned into his driveway. Robert Green stepped out, accompanied by a woman in a business suit carrying a leather portfolio. "Evening, Tom," Green called out with forced cheerfulness. "Got a minute to talk?" Tom set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Seems like you're going to talk whether I've got a minute or not." Green smiled tightly. This is Lisa Chen from Sunrise Hotels. She wanted to speak with you personally about their vision for this property. The woman stepped forward with an outstretched hand. Mr. Wilson, it's a pleasure to meet you. We're very excited about the potential of your land. Tom shook her hand briefly. Ms. Chen. What can I do for you? May we come inside? I have some concept drawings I'd like to show you. Tom hesitated, then nodded. Kitchen's this way. Don't mind the mess. Seated at his kitchen table, Lisa opened her portfolio and spread out several glossy renderings. They showed a sprawling resort with a central building designed to resemble a modernized barn, surrounded by luxury cabins, a golf course, and an artificial lake where his pond currently stood. We call it Heritage Farm Resort, Lisa explained enthusiastically. We want to honor the agricultural history of the area while providing a premium experience for our guests. Tom looked at the drawings without comment, noting how they'd completely erased every trace of his actual farm's character. The best part, Green interjected, is that we're prepared to offer you a position as a consultant. Your knowledge of the land, the local farming traditions, it would add authenticity to the experience. Authenticity, Tom repeated slowly. You want to bulldoze my family's home and then hire me to tell your guests about how nice it used to be. Lisa shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Wilson, we understand your attachment to this place. That's why we've increased our offer to $2.5 million. That's more than fair market value. Tom looked at her directly. Did Robert here tell you how long my family's owned this land? Did he mention the survey my grandfather had done in 1935? Lisa glanced at Green, confusion evident on her face. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I didn't think so. Tom stood up. I appreciate you coming by, but I'm not interested in selling. Green's friendly facade cracked. Be reasonable, Tom. This is going to happen whether you like it or not. The county commissioners are already discussing eminent domain options for the access road. Is that a threat, Robert? It's reality. Progress is coming to Pine Ridge. You can benefit from it or get run over by it. Tom remained calm. I guess we'll see which happens. He gestured toward the door. I've got work to finish before dark. After they left, Tom returned to his barn. In the far corner, covered by a tarp, was an old chest his grandfather had always kept locked. Tom had opened it only once before, after his father passed away. Now, he removed the tarp and lifted the creaking lid. Inside lay the key to Tom's plan, and to the true value of the Wilson farm. As darkness fell, Tom made a phone call to an old army buddy who now worked as an environmental lawyer in the state capitol. Hey, Jim. It's Tom Wilson. Remember that favor you owe me from Baghdad? I think it's time to collect. 2 days later, Tom's farm received unexpected visitors. 3 government vehicles pulled up his driveway early in the morning. Men and women in official jackets climbed out, carrying equipment and clipboards. Tom watched from his porch, sipping coffee, a slight smile playing on his lips. The lead official, a woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, approached him. Mr. Wilson? I'm Dr. Abby Reynolds from the State Environmental Protection Agency. We received some very interesting documentation regarding your property. Tom nodded. Morning, Dr. Reynolds. Coffee? No, thank you. We have a lot of ground to cover today. She gestured to her team, who were already setting up equipment. Your friend Jim Ramirez sent over some compelling historical surveys. If they're accurate, this could be quite significant. Tom set down his mug. My grandfather knew what he had. Just didn't have the means to prove it back then. From across the road, Robert Green's SUV pulled to a stop. He stepped out, visibly agitated as he approached the gathering of officials. What's going on here? Green demanded, eyeing the government vehicles with suspicion. Dr. Reynolds turned to him with professional detachment. "And you are?" "Robert Green, president of the Lakeside Estates HOA. We have development plans pending for this area." "What's this about?" "Mr. Green, we're conducting an environmental survey based on historical documentation recently submitted to our office." She turned back to Tom. "Mr. Wilson, would you mind showing us to the eastern creek bed?" Tom led the team across his property while Green followed, making calls on his cell phone. As they reached the small stream that cut through the eastern section of the farm, technicians began taking water and soil samples. "Your grandfather's notes mentioned unusual rock formations and water quality here," Dr. Reynolds said, examining the creek bank. "Based on his observations and Jim's preliminary testing, we have reason to believe this may be part of an undocumented aquifer system, possibly connected to the state's protected watershed." Green, overhearing this, ended his call abruptly. "An aquifer? That's ridiculous. This has been farmland for decades." "Precisely why it remained undisturbed," Dr. Reynolds replied calmly. "Mr. Wilson's family has been practicing sustainable farming methods that preserve the natural hydrology." Tom watched silently as the team worked. His grandfather's journal had detailed unusual properties in the water that never ran dry, even during the worst drought in county history. The Geological Survey from 1935 had suspected an underground water source but lacked modern technology to confirm it. By midday, the preliminary findings were clear enough that Dr. Reynolds approached Tom with a serious expression. "Mr. Wilson, pending final analysis, we're going to recommend this area for protected status. If confirmed, this aquifer feeds into 3 counties' water supplies." Green's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is a delay tactic. He put you up to this." Dr. Reynolds turned to him coldly. "Sir, questioning the integrity of a state environmental assessment is not advisable. Perhaps you should consult your attorneys before making accusations." As Green stormed off toward his vehicle, Tom gazed across his land. The hotel plans would soon hit a major obstacle, an environmental protection order that no amount of HOA influence could easily overcome. But this was just the beginning of Tom's plan. The news spread quickly through Pine Ridge. Wilson's Aquifer, people called it, though the official designation was still pending. Local papers ran front-page stories about the unexpected discovery, complete with quotes from environmental experts about its significance to the region's water supply. Tom found himself suddenly popular at the local diner where he occasionally had breakfast. Folks who'd barely nodded at him before now stopped by his table to chat, congratulate him, or simply express their relief that the hotel development might be halted. "Never liked those lakeside people anyway," said Joe Franklin, owner of the town's feed store. "Acting like they own the place just 'cause they got money." Tom accepted the attention modestly. This wasn't about popularity, it was about protecting what was his. And he wasn't done yet. A week after the environmental team's visit, Tom received an official letter from the county commissioners requesting a meeting. The same commissioners who, according to Green, had been discussing eminent domain options for an access road through Tom's property. The meeting was set for the following Monday at the county building. Tom arrived early, dressed in his one good suit, which hadn't seen use since his father's funeral. He brought with him a leather folder containing carefully selected documents. The commissioner's meeting room was already crowded when he entered. Several lakeside residents sat in a group, Robert Green among them. Representatives from Sunrise Hotels occupied another section. Local townspeople filled most of the remaining seats, with news reporters standing along the walls. Commissioner Frank Walters, a silver-haired man Tom had known for years, called the meeting to order. "We've got one item on today's agenda, the proposed Heritage Farm Resort development and the recent environmental findings on the Wilson property." Robert Green was the first to speak, his voice tight with controlled anger. While we respect environmental concerns, we believe this sudden discovery is suspicious at best. The timing, just as our development plans were finalizing, suggests this may be a deliberate obstruction tactic. Lisa Chen from Sunrise Hotels followed with a presentation showing revised plans. We've adjusted our design to work around the eastern section of the property. We can preserve the aquifer area while still moving forward with a slightly scaled-back resort. The hotel's attorney added, and we're prepared to increase our offer to Mr. Wilson to $3 million, with additional funds set aside for environmental monitoring. Tom listened quietly as various speakers took turns. Lakeside residents complained about lost property value if the hotel wasn't built. Environmental advocates argued for maximum protection of the newly discovered aquifer. The county treasurer mentioned the potential tax revenue the resort would bring. When Tom's turn finally came, he approached the podium calmly. The room fell silent. "I appreciate everyone's concern about my land," he began, opening his folder. "But there's something important you should know." He pulled out a yellow document and handed copies to the commissioners. "This is the original deed to my property, dated 1932. If you'll look at paragraph 3, there's a conservation easement my grandfather included when he purchased the land." Commissioner Walters put on his reading glasses and leaned forward. His eyes widened slightly as he read. "This easement prohibits any commercial development larger than 5 acres for a period of 100 years from the date of purchase," Tom continued. "It was properly filed with the county, though it seems to have been overlooked in recent discussions." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as Tom's second move in his hidden plan took effect. The conservation easement revelation sent shockwaves through the meeting room. The hotel's attorney immediately requested a recess to review the document, while Robert Greene huddled with his lawyers in a corner, their expressions grim. Commissioner Walters cleared his throat. "We'll take a 30-minute break to allow all parties to examine these documents." In the hallway, Tom found himself approached by several local residents who patted him on the back and offered words of support. Among them was Nancy Baker, who owned the small farm adjacent to his. "Your grandfather was a smart man, Tom," she said with admiration. "My father always spoke highly of him." Tom nodded. He didn't trust developers even back then. Said they always think about the next quarter, never the next generation. When the meeting resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The hotel's attorney spoke first, his tone notably less confident. "While we acknowledge the existence of this conservation easement, we believe there may be legal grounds to challenge its validity after so many years. Environmental conditions and county needs have changed significantly since 1932. Commissioner Walters turned to the county attorney. "Jane, what's your assessment?" The county attorney adjusted her glasses. "Preliminary examination suggests the easement was properly executed and recorded. Conservation easements are specifically designed to remain in force despite changing conditions. Challenging it would be difficult and time-consuming." Robert Greene stood up without being recognized. "This is absurd. One stubborn old man shouldn't be able to block progress for an entire community." "Mr. Greene, please wait to be recognized before speaking," Commissioner Walters admonished. Lisa Chen from Sunrise Hotels raised her hand and was acknowledged. "Given these unexpected complications, Sunrise Hotels needs to re-evaluate our position. We were not made aware of these limitations during our preliminary site assessments." She glanced at Greene with barely concealed irritation before continuing. "We operate in many communities and always strive to be good corporate citizens. If this location has both environmental sensitivity and legal restrictions, we may need to consider alternative sites." The meeting continued for another hour, but the momentum had clearly shifted. By the end, the commissioners voted to table any decisions regarding the Wilson property pending further legal review and completion of the environmental study. As people filed out of the meeting room, Robert Greene confronted Tom in the hallway. "This isn't over, Wilson," he said, his voice low but intense. You think you're clever, but there are ways around easements. Ways around environmental restrictions too. Tom met his gaze steadily. Maybe so. But fighting those battles takes time and money. How long before your hotel partners lose patience and look elsewhere? How will your HOA members feel when their promised property value increases don't materialize? Green's face flushed. We'll see who lasts longer. Your little farm operation barely breaks even most years. How long can you hold out? Tom smiled slightly. My needs are simple. My mortgage was paid off 20 years ago. Can your HOA members say the same? As Green stormed away, Tom walked to his truck, where Jim Ramirez, his environmental lawyer friend, was waiting. Ready for Phase 3? Jim asked. Tom nodded. They still don't understand what they're really fighting against. Time to show them. The next morning, a caravan of vehicles headed up Tom's driveway. Unlike the government vehicles from before, these were vans from local TV stations and a truck from the State University's Geology Department. Jim Ramirez had arranged this media event perfectly, timing it to coincide with the morning news cycle. Dr. Patel, the head of the university's Geology Department, set up a display board showing detailed maps of the underground water system while cameras rolled. Tom stood nearby with Jim, looking appropriately humble as reporters gathered around. What we've discovered, Dr. Patel explained to the cameras, is not just an ordinary aquifer. Preliminary testing suggests this is an artesian aquifer with unusually pure water. The mineral content is remarkably similar to some of the world's most famous natural spring waters. A reporter raised her hand. Are you saying this water has commercial value? Dr. Patel nodded. Potentially significant value. Many premium bottled water companies search for sources exactly like this, naturally filtered, mineral-rich water that requires minimal processing. Another reporter turned to Tom. Mr. Wilson, did you know about this when the hotel developers were trying to buy your land? Tom chose his words carefully. My grandfather's journals mentioned the water's special qualities. He always told us never to take it for granted. But understanding its true value? That's recent. And what are your plans now? The reporter pressed. Jim stepped forward. Mr. Wilson has partnered with our environmental law firm and the university to explore sustainable options. We're establishing the Wilson Springs Conservation Trust to protect the aquifer while allowing limited bottling operations that won't impact the water table. From across the road, Robert Greene watched the media circus with mounting horror. He'd already received 3 angry calls from lakeside residents who'd seen the morning news. When his phone rang again, it was Lisa Chen from Sunrise Hotels. Robert, we're pulling out, she said without preamble. Our investors won't touch a project with this much controversy and legal uncertainty. You can't do that. Greene protested. We've invested thousands in preparation and legal fees. Those costs are yours, not ours, Lisa replied coldly. You assured us this acquisition would be straightforward. Our company won't be associated with forcing out a local farmer sitting on an environmentally sensitive water source. The publicity would be disastrous. As Greene watched the reporters interviewing Tom, a county vehicle pulled up to his house. A man in a suit approached with an official-looking envelope, notice of a code violation for the unpermitted fence extension Greene had installed last summer. The very type of violation he'd reported Tom for repeatedly. Later that afternoon, Tom sat at his kitchen table with Jim and Dr. Patel, reviewing paperwork for the new conservation trust. The deal with Mountain Pure Water will generate enough sustainable income to maintain the property indefinitely, Jim explained. They're committed to environmentally responsible practices, and the limited operation will take up less than 3 acres. Tom nodded, looking out his window at the fields his family had tended for generations. And the rest of the land? Protected within the trust, Dr. Patel confirmed. No development, just conservation and your continued small-scale farming. Tom smiled as he signed the papers. Phase 3 was complete, securing not just protection for his land but its future as well. But he wasn't quite finished with Robert Greene and the Lakeside HOA yet. 2 weeks later, the Lakeside Estates HOA held an emergency meeting. The community center was packed with angry residents demanding answers about the failed hotel deal and plummeting property values. Robert Greene stood at the podium, sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights. I understand your frustration, but this setback is temporary. We're exploring other development opportunities that could still benefit our community. What about the legal fees? Called out a woman from the back. My quarterly statement shows a special assessment of $1,200 for ongoing legal consultation. We're paying for your failed hotel scheme. Greene tugged at his collar. Those expenses were necessary to protect our community's interests. The board voted unanimously. Because you didn't tell us the whole story, interrupted another resident. You said this was a sure thing. As the meeting descended into chaos, the door opened and Tom Wilson walked in, accompanied by Jim Ramirez and a woman in a business suit. The room gradually fell silent as people noticed his presence. Greene's face hardened. This is a private HOA meeting, Wilson. You're not welcome here. Jim stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Wilson has every right to be here. As of yesterday, he owns a property within Lakeside Estates. Murmurs swept through the crowd as Jim continued. Ms. Patel here represents a family that decided to sell their home after learning about the special assessments levied for the failed hotel project. Mr. Wilson purchased it at a very reasonable price. Greene gripped the podium. That's against our bylaws. All sales must be approved by the board. The woman in the business suit spoke up. I'm Diane Patel, attorney for my parents. We reviewed your bylaws thoroughly. There's no such requirement, only design approvals for modifications. The sale is complete and legally binding. Tom finally spoke, his voice calm. As a Lakeside Estates property owner, I've been reviewing the HOA financial statements. I noticed some interesting expenditures authorized solely by Mr. Greene, payments to a private investigator to dig into my background, fees to a consultant with connections to the county inspector who suddenly found violations on my farm. He pulled out several printed pages. I believe these expenses weren't properly approved according to your own bylaws, which require a full board vote for any expenditure over $5,000. The room erupted again, with residents shouting questions at Greene. There's more, Tom continued when the noise subsided. The conservation trust I've established is offering to purchase the undeveloped buffer zone between Lakeside Estates and my farm. The appraisal value is $1.2 million. That money would more than cover the legal fees and special assessments currently being charged to residents. Greene looked stunned. You can't do this. Actually, he can, Jim said. And as legal counsel for multiple Lakeside residents now, I've drafted a motion to remove the current board and hold new elections. We have signatures from over 60% of homeowners. A slow smile spread across Tom's face as he addressed the crowd. I don't want to be your enemy. I never did. I just wanted to protect my family's land. Now I'm offering a solution that benefits everyone, except those who tried to take what wasn't theirs to take. As residents began to sign the petition being passed around, Greene slumped into a chair, watching his carefully constructed power base crumble before his eyes. 1 month later, Tom stood at the edge of his property watching workers install a modest sign, Wilson Springs Conservation Area. On the other side, where Lakeside Estates began, another new sign had replaced the pretentious gold-lettered one, Lakeside Community, proud neighbors of Wilson Springs. Nancy Baker pulled up in her pickup truck and joined Tom at the fence line. As the newly elected HOA president, she had been instrumental in rebuilding the relationship between the farm and the development. The buffer zone transfer is complete, she said, handing Tom a folder of documents. The Conservation Trust now legally owns those 10 acres. No one can build there, ever. Tom nodded, satisfaction evident in his eyes. How are the residents handling everything? Better than expected. That refund check from the trust certainly helped, Nancy smiled. Amazing how quickly attitudes change when people get money back instead of assessments. They walked together along the property line, where landscapers were planting native trees and shrubs to create a natural border between the properties. Any word from Green? Tom asked. Nancy shook her head. Put his house on the market last week. Word is he's moving to Arizona. The new board is still sorting through the financial mess he left behind, but at least the lawsuits have been dropped. When they reached the small creek that marked the beginning of the aquifer area, they found Dr. Patel overseeing a team from the university taking water samples. Good news, Tom, Dr. Patel called out. The water quality remains exceptional. The initial production tests with Mountain Pure are showing great results without any negative impact on the aquifer levels. Tom looked pleased. The limited bottling operation was housed in a small, environmentally sensitive facility that blended with the landscape. It provided 5 local jobs and steady income for the Conservation Trust while using less than 1% of the aquifer's capacity. Later that afternoon, Tom drove into town for the community council meeting. As he walked into the town hall, people greeted him warmly, a marked change from the days when he was just the stubborn old farmer holding up Progress. Mayor Johnson gavelled the meeting to order. First item on today's agenda. Final approval for the Wilson Springs Educational Center. Tom watched as the council unanimously approved the plans for the small educational facility to be built on the edge of his property. It would host school field trips and community events, teaching about sustainable farming, water conservation, and local history. As Tom drove home at sunset, he took the long route past the abandoned construction equipment at the site where the hotel was supposed to have been built. Sunrise Hotels had found another location 20 miles away, outside of Pine Ridge entirely. He pulled into his driveway and parked beside his old barn, which now housed a small museum displaying his grandfather's journals and survey equipment, along with the original deed and conservation easement that had saved the farm. Inside his kitchen, Tom opened his grandfather's journal to a passage he'd read countless times: "Land isn't just soil. It's stories and futures and possibilities. Protect it, not just for what it's worth today, but for what it might mean tomorrow." Tom smiled. His grandfather would have approved of how things had turned out. The land was safe, the community was healing, and the future looked promising. But there was still one more piece of his plan to reveal. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Tom stood before a crowd gathered on his property. Local residents, both from town and lakeside estates, sat in folding chairs facing a podium. Behind Tom, a large building covered by a tarp awaited unveiling. Mayor Johnson introduced him with warm praise. "Today we celebrate not just the opening of the Wilson Springs Educational Center, but also the vision of a man who reminded us all what community really means." Tom approached the microphone, uncomfortable with the attention but determined to see his final plan through. "My family has farmed this land for 3 generations. We never had much money, but we had something more valuable, a legacy of stewardship." He gestured to the crowd. What happened here wasn't about one farmer against developers. It was about remembering that some things shouldn't be measured just by profit margins. Nancy Baker and other lakeside residents nodded in agreement, many of them now volunteers at the conservation area. "Today, I'm announcing the final phase of what my grandfather started," Tom continued. "The Wilson Family Trust is establishing a scholarship program for local students pursuing degrees in environmental science, sustainable agriculture, or water management." Murmurs of surprise and approval spread through the audience. Each year, 3 students will receive full college scholarships. The funds come from the bottling operation royalties, ensuring that the water nurturing this land will now nurture our community's future. Tom paused, his voice growing softer. But the most important announcement is about the land itself. He unfolded a document and held it up. This morning, I signed papers placing the entire farm, all 50 acres, into a permanent conservation trust, with provisions for continued sustainable farming and educational use. When I'm gone, this land won't be sold or developed. It will remain as it is today, a green space for generations to come. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Among them was Dr. Reynolds from the Environmental Protection Agency, who had helped draft the conservation plan, and Jim Ramirez, whose legal expertise had made it possible. After the ceremony, as people toured the new educational center with its interactive exhibits about aquifers and sustainable farming, Tom slipped away to his favorite spot by the pond. There, a simple bench had been installed with a small plaque bearing his grandfather's words about land and legacy. He sat down, feeling a profound sense of peace. The hotel would never be built here. The aquifer would remain protected. Local students would benefit from scholarships for generations. And the land would stay as his grandfather had intended, unspoiled and productive. From this quiet spot, he could just see the edge of lakeside estates, where new walking trails now connected the communities instead of dividing them. Children from both the development and town regularly visited the farm for educational programs. An unexpected movement caught his eye, a young deer emerging from the trees to drink from the pond, unafraid and at home on land that would remain its habitat forever. Tom smiled. His grandfather had hidden more than conservation easements and aquifer maps in those old journals. He'd hidden wisdom about playing the long game, about fighting not with anger but with patience and foresight. In the end, Tom hadn't just saved his farm. He'd created something better than what had existed before: connection, education, and a protected future for the land he loved. The poor man's farm had become everyone's treasure.